You have probably seen the headline: Virginia released 100 bluebirds into the Shenandoah Valley, and what happened was impossible. The story spreads across social media every spring. A heroic state agency, a quiet release at dawn, a species saved. But that release never happened. What nobody knew at the time was that the real story is stranger, slower, and more remarkable than any single release could ever be. There was no state agency that rescued the Eastern Bluebird. There was no captive breeding program. There were no helicopters carrying crates of birds into the valleys of Virginia. Instead, there was a retired biochemist in Maryland, a country ornithologist in Illinois, and a few thousand volunteers with wooden boxes, hand drills, and patience. By 2024, the result of their quiet work was this: Virginia alone fledged 17,000 bluebirds in a single year. The species that ornithologists in 1969 had publicly predicted would be extinct before the end of the 20th century is now thriving across the entire eastern United States. This is how it actually happened. 50 years before the Eastern Bluebird became a conservation success story, it was disappearing. And almost nobody outside of a small circle of ornithologists understood why. To make sense of the comeback, you have to go back to the collapse. In the early 1900s, bluebirds were as common in Virginia as robins. They nested in the cavities of dead trees along fence lines, in old apple orchards, in the hollow posts that marked rural property boundaries. Farmers in the Shenandoah Valley considered them a working bird. They ate grasshoppers, beetles, and crickets by the thousand, and they did it for free. Then, slowly, the bluebirds began to vanish. The first cause arrived from England. In the 1800s, settlers in New York released a small flock of house sparrows, hoping the bird would control insect pests in the growing city. The sparrows did not stay in New York. Within a few decades, they had spread across the entire eastern half of the continent. They were aggressive, prolific, and willing to fight to the death for nest cavities. They took everything the bluebirds needed. Then came the second invader. In 1890, a man named Eugene Schieffelin released 60 European starlings into Central Park. By the 1940s, starlings numbered in the hundreds of millions across North America. Like the sparrows, they wanted cavities. Unlike the sparrows, they were strong enough to evict a bluebird mother mid-incubation. They would peck nestlings to death and throw the bodies out of the box. The bluebirds had no answer for either bird. That was only round one. In the 1940s, American agriculture industrialized. DDT moved through the food chain and into the insects that bluebirds ate. Dead trees, the natural source of cavities, were cleared from fence lines because they looked untidy. House cats, kept indoors before the war, were now allowed to roam in growing suburbs. They killed an estimated 2.5 billion birds a year in the United States. Bluebirds, slow and ground foraging, were easy targets. By 1970, the count was done. The Eastern Bluebird population had dropped by 92% across the country. A New York newspaper printed a sentence that would haunt American conservation for the next decade. Bluebirds, the paper wrote, don't have much to sing about these days. They are disappearing so rapidly almost everywhere east of the Rockies that they may become extinct before the end of the century. I mean, think about that for a second. A bird that had been a fixture of every American farm for 3 centuries was being eulogized in a regional newspaper. Ornithologists at major universities began writing the species off. Field guides started using the phrase "formerly common." And then, the winter of 1977 came. The bluebirds had no idea what was coming. That winter, recorded as the coldest North American winter in 110 years, killed an estimated 60% of the remaining Eastern Bluebird population in a single season. Across the Shenandoah Valley, volunteers who had been monitoring the few remaining nest sites reported empty boxes by spring. The decline that had taken 50 years was nearly completed in 3 months. But while the species was collapsing, something else was happening. Something almost nobody outside of a few small ornithology circles had noticed. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains everything. In 1926, more than 4 decades before that brutal winter, a man named Thomas Musselman in Quincy, Illinois, had quietly begun an experiment. Musselman was a teacher and an amateur ornithologist. He had watched the bluebirds disappear from the fence lines around his town, and he had developed a theory. The birds were not dying out because they could not survive. They were dying out because they had nowhere to nest. In 1934, Musselman put his theory into practice. He built 25 small wooden boxes, each with an entrance hole exactly 1.5 inches across. He drove out into the Illinois countryside and nailed them to fence posts, spaced about 100 yards apart along a country road. He called it a bluebird trail. The hole, he had calculated, was just small enough that a European starling could not squeeze through. The bluebirds, by contrast, fit perfectly. The boxes worked. Over the next 40 years, Musselman personally built and installed more than 1,000 nest boxes across western Illinois. He taught local farmers, school teachers, and Boy Scout troops how to build them. He wrote articles for ornithology journals. And quietly, in the small patches of Illinois farmland where his trails ran, the bluebirds began to come back. The problem was that almost nobody outside of his region knew about it. That changed in 1977. A retired biochemist from Maryland named Lawrence Zellini had spent 30 years at the United States Department of Agriculture, and he had spent his spare time monitoring the bluebirds in his backyard. He had read Musselman's old papers, he had built his own boxes, and he had watched, year after year, as the birds returned to his property even while they disappeared from everywhere else. In June of 1977, Zellini published an article in National Geographic. It was titled, "Song of Hope for the Bluebirds." It explained in plain language what Musselman had figured out 50 years earlier. The bluebirds did not need a rescue, they needed boxes. The article landed in 12 million American mailboxes. Within months, letters began pouring into the USDA from across the country. Farmers wanted plans, school teachers wanted blueprints. Retired engineers wanted to know exactly what dimensions to cut the wood. Zellini answered every letter he could. On March 20th, 1978, less than a year after the article ran, he formally incorporated the North American Bluebird Society. The recovery had begun, and nobody in the federal government, no state wildlife agency, and no major conservation foundation had been involved. If you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. We cover the untold stories of American wildlife every week, and the next one is the story of the largest predator return in modern American history. Stepping back, what was happening in the late 1970s was unprecedented in conservation history. A wildlife recovery was being run entirely by retired people with hand tools. In Virginia, the movement found its perfect terrain. The Shenandoah Valley is a long, narrow corridor of farmland and open meadow between two mountain ranges. It is exactly the habitat Eastern Bluebirds prefer. Open ground for hunting insects, fence lines for perching, and, critically, miles and miles of property boundaries where wooden boxes could be mounted. The first Virginia bluebird trail of any real size was established at the Blandy Experimental Farm, an arboretum owned by the University of Virginia in Clark County. Volunteers began with a few dozen boxes in the early 1980s. By the early 1990s, the trail had grown to 132 boxes, each one monitored weekly during nesting season. The data they collected was meticulous. Every egg laid, every hatchling fledged, every failed nest. The numbers told a story nobody had expected. Fledging rates inside the boxes were running at over 80%. In the wild, with natural cavities, the rate had been closer to 40. The wooden boxes were not just compensating for lost habitat. They were producing more bluebirds per nest than the original ecosystem had ever managed. And that was the part that even long-time ornithologists had not predicted. Word spread through the valley. A retired park ranger in Warren County built a trail of 106 boxes along the Shenandoah River. A team of master naturalists at Sky Meadows State Park, led by a woman named Margaret Wester, installed 96 boxes through the rolling grassland of the Upper Piedmont. In Loudoun County, the Loudoun Wildlife Conservancy began recruiting volunteers to monitor entire networks of trails. By the early 2000s, they were running nearly 700 nest boxes across 57 separate trails, all of it monitored by unpaid citizens with clipboards. In 1996, the volunteers organized. The Virginia Bluebird Society was incorporated as a statewide nonprofit affiliated with Zellini's North American Bluebird Society. Their mandate was simple: build boxes, monitor boxes, report data. They did not lobby for legislation. They did not request federal grants. They did not run captive breeding programs. They built wooden boxes with 1.5-inch holes, and they nailed them to fence posts. The Bluebirds did the rest. By the year 2015, the United States Geological Survey had documented something remarkable. The Eastern Bluebird population had been growing by more than 1.5% per year, every year, for almost 5 decades. The species that field guides had labeled formerly common was now estimated at over 20 million breeding pairs across North America. In 1999, the state of New York formally removed the Eastern Bluebird from its endangered species list. And that is the kind of number that makes accountants cry. From a 90% collapse to over 20 million breeding pairs, with no federal program, no captive breeding, and no central authority, just boxes. In 2024, the Virginia Bluebird Society held its annual meeting and released its yearly count. Across the state, volunteers were now monitoring 365 separate trails. The trails contained 4,500 nest boxes. In a single breeding season, the boxes had produced 23,500 fledgling birds. Of those, 17,000 were Eastern Bluebirds. 17,000 bluebirds in one state in 1 year, from a species that, 50 years earlier, was being eulogized as functionally extinct. But here is the part the story usually leaves out. The Eastern Bluebird recovery is not just the largest citizen-led wildlife restoration in American history. It is also a quiet warning. The recovery was possible because the bird's main threat was a lack of cavities. And cavities are something a person with a saw, a drill, and a Saturday afternoon can manufacture. Most species in decline do not have that kind of solvable problem. Most species need land, not boxes. Most species need policy, not master naturalists. The bluebird was lucky in the specific shape of its crisis, and even now, the gains are fragile. Climate change is shifting the timing of insect hatches that bluebirds depend on to feed nestlings. Urban sprawl is removing the open grassland the species needs to hunt. House sparrows still kill bluebirds in their nests every spring, in every state, in numbers that volunteers can document but cannot stop. The 17,000 fledglings from Virginia last year exist only because 365 trails are still being walked every week by aging volunteers. When those volunteers stop, the boxes will not maintain themselves. So the next time you see the headline, the one that says, "Virginia released 100 bluebirds into the valley," remember the real story. There was no release. There was no rescue. There were just boxes, 1.5-inch holes nailed to fence posts, spaced 100 yards apart across one of the most beautiful stretches of farmland in the eastern United States. A retired biochemist wrote a magazine article. An Illinois schoolteacher had figured it out 50 years before anyone listened. And a state full of volunteers picked up hammers. The bluebirds did the rest.